But I want to point out to everybody, both Adam and Jesus thought that it wasn't right that they weren't clothed, and they both set about to want to be clothed. Right. But they both implemented a different methodology. Okay? So we could look at Adam and we could say it's not right that he's not clothed. Right? Yeah. And we could say Adam needs to be clothed. It's not right for him to be naked. He needs to be clothed. Right. Okay? So those things could be true and those things can be good. But what methodology are we implementing to see what is good come to pass? Right? So we see Jesus. Jesus was naked on the cross. We see he needed to be clothed. But what was the methodology that he put to work? Right? And we want to be able to discern that just because something points to something that's good doesn't mean the methodology that's being used is good. Neither does it mean that it can bring about what it says is good. Yeah. Because we both know that Adam wanted to be clothed, and he tried to become clothed, and he still ended up naked, right? Which is the way of the world, right? So the world cries out for something good. The problem is the thing that it implements to try to bring about what is good is that which has brought the destruction to begin with. And that's one of the things that breaks my heart. My heart does not just grieve over the suffering people experience, but then the thing we implement to deal with the suffering is going to, like it says, and of his fullness that we received and grace upon grace. Man, listen, the thing we're implementing now to try to deal with the suffering people have experienced, that is going to heap upon people destruction upon destruction. It's going to heap upon more destruction. It's going to heap upon more violence. Right? Yeah. Jesus said that up until now, the kingdom of God suffered violence because people tried to take it by force. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. And so the violent are those who try to establish their life by force. Those are the violent. It doesn't matter if what they're pointing to, wanting to establish is good or not. If they're going to look to their own strength or their own force to establish what they say is good, that's violence. Mm-hmm. Okay? Jesus said those are the violent, the ones who try to take the kingdom by force, or they try to establish the life they say they should have by force. Those are the violent. The gospel is an inconvenient truth for everybody, right? It's just an inconvenient truth for what we want to believe in our own self-righteousness. Right? The things we want to profess, thinking that we're good because of our great profession. It's an inconvenient truth. It's an inconvenient truth for Americans. I mean, I've been hammering this for a long time now. It's an inconvenient truth for you guys and my dad and his generation for me to say the things that I did. Listen, man, the United States was born from a rebellion. You don't see the disciples or the apostles rebelling against Rome. That's an inconvenient truth for us. We don't want to hear that because we've been brought up to think America is the power into a good life. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not against America. But we need to have our ideologies challenged by God. Right? And so it's an inconvenient truth to think that the people who want to establish their own life by force are filled with violence. That's what violence is. Mm-hmm. Right? Those are the people who are filled with violence. Now, Jesus then also comes and talks about the peacemakers. And that's why my heart grieves right now, because we don't just have suffering going on, but then we have a bunch of people eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil concerning the suffering. And the church is supposed to be the peacemakers in the earth, and 95% of the church are propagating the eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So now we're heaping more destruction upon the suffering that's already going down. And so who's the peacemakers? You know who the peacemakers? This is an inconvenient truth for us. We don't like this because it's not consistent with our idea of what justice is. Which, listen, man, one of the reasons why we got a twisted view of what justice is because we got a twisted view of what God thinks justice is. Right? But this is how Jesus described the peacemaker. That when they're faced with injustice, when a peacemaker is faced with injustice, do you know what they do? They turn the other cheek. They love their enemies. They bless those who curse them. They pray for those that despitefully use them. And do you know what they pray? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's a peacemaker. That's a peacemaker. And we don't have any of that going on. And we have a whole lot of the other going on. And what it's doing is, because the way we're trying to deal with the suffering is born from self-justification, what it does is it stirs up strife and envy and backbiting and gossip, where you're devouring one another. Where you're devouring one another. So walking after the Spirit and walking after the flesh, within this dynamic, do you know what walking after the Spirit would look like? When I face injustice, I'm going to look to God and what he's done in raising Jesus from the dead to serve me with justice. I'm not going to look to the arm of the flesh to take justice, right, or try to force justice. That's walking after the Spirit, right? Injustice is in the earth, and when you face injustice, you look to the justice God served all people with when he raised Jesus from the dead, having conquered death. You're walking after the Spirit. Now, that will cause you to love your enemies, right? But if you're walking after the flesh,
sorry, just a second,
is that in the face of injustice, or in the face of encountering justice, you now going to look to your own ability to try to bring about justice, walking after the flesh. And that will cause you to backbite and devour one another instead of loving one another, right? Yep. Where you look at each other and you decide whether or not you think the other person is doing what they should be doing or not. That's backbiting and devouring. That's born from walking after the flesh, right? Whereby if they're not doing what you think needs to be done in order to bring about life, then they now become the enemy, right? You see the whole problem with that. You decide what needs to be done in order to bring forth life, right? And now you're going to get busy judging all the people around you by whether or not they're implementing your idea about how we're going to bring forth life. All the while, you got no idea about how to bring forth life, right? All the while, you're actually implementing the thing that brings forth more destruction, right? That's what's going on. And so, man, we need peacemakers. Yep. We need people that would feel compassion for everyone. How can you recognize any kind of a movement, and whether it's born from the world? It divides people up. It divides them up by race. It divides them up by sex. It divides them up by money. It divides them up by any different thing that it can do. It gets the people divided. That's how you know something comes from the world, right? How do you know something that comes from God? It doesn't divide anybody up by the flesh. Jesus says he knows no person after the flesh. He said there's no more male or female. He doesn't divide human beings up by the color of their skin, by their money, by their sex, by their status. And all those things are foolishness in the eyes of God. So when you would speak to one human being, meaning that every human being has experienced the same kind of a thing, right? It's called death. We've all experienced death, and we all want to experience life. So that's why it's called the temptation common to humans. It doesn't say the temptation common to white people. It doesn't say the temptation common to black people. It doesn't say, well, this culture, the temptation is this and not that. The hell it does. It says the temptation that comes to every human being is death. Jesus came and stood in the face of that temptation. We're all the same. It's the same enemy we all have. The enemy is death. Now, death can bring forth different kinds of fruit. And it can bring forth this fruit of death and that fruit of death. And so it can be a different fruit of death that has reached out and touched all of us in a different way, but make no mistake about it, the enemy is still death, right? That's the enemy. That's all of our enemy. It's death. The wisdom that's from above will never break human beings apart and separate them. It will never say things like, you don't understand my suffering. Guess what? That never came out of God's mouth. In the moment you said that, I don't care what you're hoping to bring about. That's the poison of asp. It's the poison of asp. When you talk to people like that, the hell they don't. They do understand. Go look at Jesus. Do you think Jesus understands your suffering? Well, if Jesus can understand your suffering, then every other human being can understand your suffering. And one of the reasons why we struggle to have compassion on each other is because we're told things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't know.
Yeah.
And then they'll tell you, you don't know. The hell I don't. Well, what do you think the person feels the moment you tell them they don't know?
Defensive. Yeah.
That's self-justification.
Yeah.
That whole conversation is based upon self-justification. And do you know what it silently tells the other person? Because I promise you, the other person has suffered at the hands of death. And the moment they're spoken to like that, do you know what they feel in their heart? They're making light of my suffering. Well, what do you think a person feels like when they feel someone else is making light of their suffering? Well, then screw their suffering.
That's right.
And now we got a bunch of people backbiting and devouring about who suffered most.
Right.
Who is it that suffered most? Have the police suffered more? Have the black people suffered more? What about these white devils that are letting the police do this? Yeah. Who suffered more? Do you see all that? Listen, man, we're not reasoning with God when we think like that. We are not reasoning with God. God's not sitting around thinking, I wonder who suffered more. Because God sees the enemy of all people is death. And he sees all people have suffered equally at the hands of death. All people. And what he would get all of us to do is identify or see ourselves in our suffering in the face of someone else. That's the only way you can feel compassion for a person, is if you can identify, I've suffered this way, and I see that same suffering, that same anguish, that same hurt that I felt over here, I see that in their face over there. Now you can identify, and you can feel, and you can come together and cry and grieve and weep together and encourage each other together, right? But the moment we can't identify with each other, forget about it, man. In the moment you come and tell someone they can't identify, forget about it, man. I promise you this, there's only one way to judge it. Every human being can identify with Jesus. Guess what that means? We can all identify with each other. Otherwise, how can we be one? Right. So any kind of a thing that comes and tries to separate us and tell us we don't know, or they don't know, or only these people know, we can't. I mean, it sounds so wise in the world, right? They don't know. Come on, man. It's like stuff that never came out of God's mouth. And so we want to at least understand what we're busy with and who are the peacemakers. How did Jesus handle it when he stood in the face of injustice? How did he handle it? Turn the other cheek. He loved his enemies. He prayed for those that were despitefully using him. He blessed those who were cursing them. Father, forgive them, for they know not. He was being a peacemaker. That's the only way peace can come in the face of an injustice. That's the only way. And that's actually God's way of doing justice. That a peacemaker are the ones that are doing justice in the earth. Jesus was doing justice in the earth when he was on the cross, blessing those who cursed him. He was doing justice, but we don't want to hear that because we want justice to be served in the sense of people being punished for their transgression. That's what we want. But Jesus would come and speak well of the police officers, and he would speak well of the people being brutalized by police officers. He would pray for both of them. He would feel compassion for all parties. He would look at the police officers, and his heart would bleed for the police officers because they're doing an impossible job where they know their lives are at risk, and they know people want to kill them. And it's like we think the police officers go into each one of these situations with an innocent heart. They don't. They have to go in thinking this person might try to kill me. That's how they have to go into every situation. My life is on the line. Now, how do you think that works inside of a person?
Not well.
It's not an easy thing to do. It's a painful thing to do. It's a hard thing to do for their families, for everyone. It's not pleasant. Not only that, the situations you're put in. Like, listen, it's one thing if I'm working at the finance company and I make a mistake. Whoops. I deleted someone's bad credit report. Whoops. No big deal. But these guys, they make a mistake out on the job and someone dies. Or they die. That's a heavy kind of a thing, right? We're like me. I made a mistake. I lost the wire to the camera, man, and I can't find it. But these guys are on a job where their mistakes could end with them being dead or the other person being dead. It's very heavy. What about the guys that think the police are after them to kill them? How do you think they feel every time they see a police officer? Listen, man, I kind of know because I sold drugs for a long time. And there were many times where if I got pulled over, 20 years gone. And so I became very paranoid. And every time you saw a police officer anywhere, I mean, you're freaking out. Your heart. People can't think straight when they feel that way when they see a police officer. Do you know what it's like to feel afraid? What do those people just want? They just want life. So forget about whether we agree with their politics or not. Let's try to forget about that. We don't want to let whether we agree with their conclusions based on their fear get in the way of us feeling great compassion at what they're going through because they just want life. Let's just define it that way. They just want life. Well, how many of us think there's something wrong with wanting life? Okay, so let's not judge them by what we see coming out exteriorly. Let's understand what's going on. They just want life. And now they're being pressed in on by the world around them, telling them their life is being choked out. And they feel great fear, confusion, angst, frustration, aggravation. And they don't know how to process that. And we all know that feeling, don't we? Hasn't everybody in here felt that feeling? Okay, so we want to, forget about what the world's telling us. We want to identify with what they're feeling. Not so that we can enlist our own strength to fix it, but so that we can be filled with compassion for people as they're walking through things. And we might be able to actually be of some good in those situations, right? So we want to be careful when we judge these people. And we judge what we think people are doing on both sides. And we want to feel compassion and understand how it could happen instead of jumping to this thing about trying to label everybody as the devil. They're the devil. No, they're the devil. No, you're the devil. No, we're all the devil. It's nonsense, man.
Yes, it is.
But that's what happens when your methodology for dealing with injustice is to enlist the arm of the flesh. You backbite and devour one another. Right? You cannibalize one another. You don't love one another, right? And so listen, man, I have to tell you, I understand the police officers. I understand what they have to deal with. That is not something to just be like flippant about. That's a serious, heavy thing that they have to deal with, right? And I understand what it's like to live in fear for your life. I know what that feels like. Every human knows what that feels like. And so I can understand what they're feeling. I can understand what injustice does, how it wars on the heart. In fact, I happen to know there's only one human being that actually ever gave the exact right response to injustice when he encountered it, and it was Jesus Christ. And if your response to injustice doesn't look like the man Jesus' response to injustice, don't judge yourself, but at least judge what tree you're eating from, right? I mean, it's like we implement a system thinking we'll pick off the fruit. Even if we say, maybe that guy was a racist. Who knows? We don't even know. But notice how quick we are to judge the thoughts and intents of the heart of another person. And yet none of us know.
Right.
But even if racism is the problem, how do you think we're going to take out racism? What's the solution?
Facebook.
What's the solution?
No, or writing, or even protest.
Is that going to fix racism?
It's looking to Jesus.
Because all that stuff, and it's got to be honest, it's like cleaning up the outside of the cup.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is the world's way.
Yeah.
Is to make clean the outside of the cup. All the while the inside of the cup is corrupted. And so when Jesus saw there was a tree that was producing poisonous fruit, did he go and try to pick off the poisonous fruit? What did he do? He took an axe to the root. Right? And all that I see, all the responses that I see from the injustice The most recent injustice, I don't even want to say the most recent injustice, because now a bunch of people have died and all kinds of stuff from all this. That's also injustice, right? The most recent injustice with George Floyd, that most recent injustice, the system we're implementing is not taking an axe to the root. It's to pick up the fruit on the outside. It's trying to make clean the outside of the cup, all the while never even understanding what's the real problem and what's really going on, right? And where we want to get to, something I notice about human beings, the way the wisdom in the world tries to categorize us, we all have our own judgment of what is a greater injustice. The knowledge of good and evil, right? And so some people think abortion is the greatest injustice that could happen to anybody. Other people think police brutality is the greatest injustice that could happen to anybody. Other people think it's racism is the greatest injustice that could happen to anybody. Other people think it's murder. We all have our own ideas of what is the greatest injustice that we can experience. Well, unless we're actively speaking out, I'm using the world's wisdom, I'm speaking as a fool. Unless you're speaking out about every single one of them, then man, you're a hypocrite. You've got your own special interest. And you're speaking out about that one. That's called hypocrisy. Guess what gives birth to hypocrisy? Walking after the flesh. Right? And I'm not suggesting we should get all riled up about every cause. I'm just using that as an example. Because right now we have a whole situation that we're involved in encountering that are setting some people up to judge other people as unrighteous if they don't do the socially acceptable things that they say they should be doing. That's the poison of asp, man. That's from the devil. And it's full of hypocrisy, right? And if we could just stop judging each other like that and stop judging the external and say, man, these guys are being pressed in on by the world. And it makes sense to me what they're experiencing. And then these guys, man, that's a difficult thing. They're being pressed on by the world. It makes sense to me. They're both thrown into an impossible situation. If you can't see both sides of that, then you're not looking at it. Right? You're looking through a glass darkly lit. You're looking at it from your own side.
You have your own perspective when you choose what you want to look at and what you don't.
It all begins with how are you going to handle it when you're faced with injustice? Because the wisdom you implement there is going to either bring forth a peacemaker in you or it's going to bring forth violence in you. Right? Yeah. Like this is just a pick on this situation. So it's not to pick on these people, but it's the most recent thing in our face, and we'll just look at the example. But the world has all its cute little cliches that we think sound so wise, right? Like somebody messaged me a whiteboard that said violence is silence, or silence is violence. Listen, man, I don't see Jesus say one word. And he's the peacemaker. Listen, man, whatever we think about the racism that has happened in America, Rome was many times more racist towards the Jews. And I don't see Jesus specifically speaking about racism one time. Why? Because racism would have been the fruit on the tree and not the root. And so he was after the root. He wasn't indifferent to the fruit. He wasn't indifferent to the suffering that the fruit could bring forth. But he saw the answer was the root. And so even just that saying, silence is violence, that's violence. That saying is violence. And it's filled with self-righteousness and self-justification. And it's with the intent to stir a person in the inner person and make them feel like they have to justify themselves by conforming to what somebody else says they should do. That is the devil. Absolutely. And the people aren't the devil, but we ought to recognize what tree we're eating from, right? And let's actually be busy with things that can actually bring salvation and healing. Whatever your methodology is, whatever wisdom you're implementing in this situation, at least be honest with yourself and what you're implementing. If what's coming out of your mouth is F these people or F those people, or these people deserve to die, or those. Listen, man, you're busy with the devil. What you're thinking of has not come from above. It's come from below. Right? And I think that's the thing that grieves the injustice and the suffering is bad enough. But then you see all the things people and it isn't the world. It doesn't surprise me that the world does this, but the believers. It's shocking to me. I'm like, dude. No. We implement all these systems that cause further alienation and cause further division by flesh, by race. Paul said, we no longer know any person after the flesh. So if I'm not looking at a person based on the flesh, then I'm not going to come up with fancy sayings that identify the color of their skin when I'm dealing with their problem. I'll be looking at a human being, right? And I'm going to say, what's the problem for every human being? And I'm going to say, what's the answer for every human being? And then I'm going to know what torments every human being. And then I'm going to see when a person is acting in a certain way that they're tormented, and I'm going to feel compassion. Then I can be a peacemaker, right? Where I won't curse them for cursing me. I won't
hit them when they
I won't respond with violence to their violence, right? Their violence I can understand why they're filled with violence, right? Like I can understand why people are filled with violence now. That doesn't mean it's right. I can understand why they're filled with violence because I can understand what injustice does to the human heart. Unless a person is really close with God, listen, man, injustice is designed to bring forth more violence. In fact, if you open up the serpent's toolbox, one of his greatest tools is injustice. And guess what he got right? He got it right to plant death in the earth, which meant he filled the world with injustice. And what do you think he uses that injustice to do? Tempt people. Tempt people to do what? Try to establish what they say is justice by force. Because the moment they do that, guess what comes out of them? More violence. And it just perpetuates the whole thing. It perpetuates. It brings about more death. And so the death that's already come to our country is bad enough. And now the system we're trying to implement to deal with the death is born from death. Right? Yes. There's a way that seems right unto a human being. Right? Listen, we want to talk about all the great humans that we know. Right? Like, and then we tend to categorize those great humans that we know by their fancy speeches. Right? Or by whether or not we think they stood for the right thing. We'd all be better off by thinking, did I see this in Jesus? Forget about whatever human you think was rad. Forget about whatever human you think was like the cream of your crop. How about, do I see what I'm busy with in the man Jesus? And if I don't need to judge myself as righteous or unrighteous by whether or not I see what, but let me have that discern the tree that I'm eating from, which is what we want. What tree am I eating from in the midst of this horrible situation? What tree am I eating from? And I wish the church would come together and ask themselves, what tree am I eating from in the middle of this situation? Right? Is the things coming out of my mouth, or the things that I'm saying, or the things I'm pumping on social media, can I imagine Jesus doing that same thing? And if I can't imagine Jesus doing that, can you imagine Jesus walking down the road with a sign that says, silence is violence? Yeah. Can you imagine him walking down the road with a sign like that? No. Cannot. And so we could ask ourselves, how would Jesus be navigating these things? And again, we're not doing that to say, now we must copy Jesus. And if we can copy Jesus, then we'll be acceptable. No, we're saying that so we can have every one of our thoughts about all these things taken captive to Christ. Yes. Meaning Christ can discern the thoughts and intents of our hearts. And we can at least know, what tree am I eating from? Right? That can be greatly helpful to a person. Because all of us, when we encounter injustice, are real quick in those moments to run down the road with our anger. And we're real quick to like first notice the arm of the flesh. It's not right, right? And the moment we come with it's not right, then we start our rantings, right? Then we start feeling the anger, get riled up, right? That in those moments, we want to ask ourselves, and what I'm thinking, is it consistent with Jesus? What would Jesus be doing now? Do you think Jesus will be protesting the police?
No.
Okay, now, we don't want to judge people who are protesting the police when we say that. But why? We want understanding. Why wouldn't Jesus be protesting the police? Okay? Now, none of us think it's because Jesus would be indifferent, do we? Does anybody think Jesus is indifferent to our suffering? I think he kind of put that question to bed when he allowed himself to be nailed to a tree. Yeah, that's right. So we know that he's not indifferent to our suffering. So why wouldn't he then be protesting the police? Because certainly Jesus' heart would grieve over our suffering more than our own. The Bible describes it as splagizomai, where he's rent in the deepest part of his bowels at our suffering. So why wouldn't Jesus be protesting, or why wouldn't we think he'd be protesting the police?
Well, if you go to 1 Corinthians 13, you read that love, God is love, and love does not take into account any wrongdoing.
Wrongs committed against it.
Wrong committed against it.
Yeah, you could look at how that would come out. What's important for people to consider is that the reason Jesus wouldn't be doing that is because he wouldn't see that as taking an axe to the root. He would see that as dealing with the fruit on the tree. And he would actually see that that is filled with envy and striving and backbiting and devouring. So he would see that that actually won't heal the problem. So Jesus doesn't just run around like a chicken with his head cut off when he encounters a problem. He's able to think with the mind of God when he encounters a problem. Right? So he doesn't just have an emotional reaction where he loses his stuff and just reacts a certain way. Every one of his reactions is born from the Spirit. And so he's going to go after whatever it is would take an axe to the root. And I promise you, protesting police brutality is not taking an axe to the root.
Yeah, think about how, like you said, he didn't do one single thing about the Romans or even address it. He said, I didn't come to conquer this thing that you see right here. This is not the kingdom I came to bring forth.
Yeah.
I came to bring forth the spiritual kingdom. And so he didn't deal with it.
No, and that's a very inconvenient truth for those Jewish guys.
Yes.
Just like it's an inconvenient truth for us when we encounter injustice, because we want deliverance, right? But that's one of the reasons why they rejected Jesus as the Messiah, because they're all busy thinking he's coming to destroy Rome. But Jesus,
it's going to bring justice.
listen, man, what the Romans did to those Jewish guys is heinous. It's heinous, man. It's heinous. I challenge anybody to find me one verse where Jesus speaks against the Romans.
Well, how would you take an axe to the root of what's going on?
The way you would take an axe to the root to what's going on now is you would speak against injustice, right? And so what's the cause of all this stuff? Death and the injustice of death. And so you would see death as the enemy. And so the way you would take an axe to the root is you would speak about what God did to conquer death. You would speak about what God did to serve justice, right? Because what could happen then is a person could hear, God has served me with justice. And then their heart could see the justice of God. And they could walk in the justice of God. That's what it means to comfort those who mourn, right? That's how you would actually comfort a person who mourns. I promise you, even should the mob get a hand of that police officer and do whatever they want to him, there's no comfort there. I promise you. I promise you. It wasn't the blood of Cain that would have comforted Abel. It wasn't punishment that would have comforted Abel. Abel's blood did not cry out for punishment. That's not what it cried out for, right? And so the way you speak against it is you speak against death. You speak against what it means to try to find justice from the world. You talk about the justice of God and what God does to serve people with justice. You talk about how we no longer know people after the flesh. You start attacking the root of division. You start attacking the thing that causes people to see each other as black or white, right? Or to value each other by skin color. You start speaking against that thing. You start speaking discernment concerning people's hearts and why they could react a certain way and why they could react a certain way. Listen, if I was training police officers, I'd be telling the police officers, listen, guys, we're not going to argue about whether we agree with the fact that we're brutal or that we're racist. Who cares if we agree with that thought? Maybe we don't agree with that doctrine. We say, no, we're not filled with brutality, and we are most certainly not racist. As a police officer, maybe that's how they feel. But if I was training police officers, I would say, let's put that to the side for a second, and let's consider how these people feel. And let's consider what they're going through when they encounter us. And let's be mindful of that. Let's understand what's going on in their heart, and let's feel compassion for them. That they feel that way when they encounter us. Right? And just from a practical perspective, if you train the police officers to consider the heart of the people they're dealing with, that would be helpful. And if the people that they're dealing with were also trained to think about the struggles of the police officers and what they have to go through, that would be helpful. You're dealing with the heart. But you don't have any of that going on. Right?
You don't even have it going on in churches.
That's the part that is really grieves my heart.
I was just sitting here thinking, I've been a believer for 40 some years, more or less. And the longest and most detailed discussion of injustice and justice that I've ever experienced occurred last Wednesday and tonight, out of 40 plus years of walking with Jesus. And we wonder why we struggle.
The church is too busy trying to fix the world.
Yeah.
And it's not going to fix the world.
Or being politically correct.
That's social justice.
All that is about trying to fix the world, and that's just it.
Yes.
And it's a symptom of the church thinking. You're not here to fix the world. Neither can you fix the world. And if you think you can, just ask yourself this: can you conquer death in the flesh? If you can't conquer death in the flesh, then neither can you stop this stuff from happening. There's only one person that can conquer death in the flesh. It's God. That's what we all need. See, Jesus wouldn't be protesting, not because he wasn't sad that George Floyd died with a knee in his back. That's not why he would be protesting. His heart would protest the death of George Floyd. But he would see the enemy isn't the police officer. He would see the enemy is death. And then his mind would think, how are we going to attack death? What's the answer to death? And then that's what he would be busy with. That's how he would take an axe to the root. He would identify the real enemy, and then he would attack that enemy, right? And the gospel does attack them, right? Listen, man, I get upset when things don't go right for me. I get upset when people do me wrong. I do. But I promise you, I immediately sit with God. And you know what I immediately start talking with God about? I was crucified with Christ. I'm dead to the world and the world to me. Thank you, Father, that you've liberated my life from this world. Thank you, Father, that my life is not hid in this world. I just immediately start talking about how nothing can steal from. And I tell you what, after that, I don't feel any more fight. I don't feel about I'm going to fight for my life, because my mind and my heart have become filled with what God has done to fight for my life. And I promise you, if you're walking in the work of God, you will be at rest, and you will not be striving for your life. That's an inconvenient truth. That's an inconvenient truth. And I love what Annette said. Is there such thing? I can't remember the whole post, but is there a such thing as a peaceful protest? No, I don't think so. Because I don't think the heart behind a protest is one filled with peace. Because a heart filled with peace would be the heart of Jesus when he's on the cross. And that kind of a heart doesn't fight for life. That kind of a heart prefers the other person's life. This is an inconvenient truth. God would lay down his life for the oppressor. Oh, we don't like that, do we? Okay, well, we all be damned to eternal death then. We'd all be damned to eternal death unless God was that way. Yeah. Right? Because we serve God with injustice. The greatest injustice we could think of, we served a God. And what did God do? He was unwilling to impute our transgression to us. But you know what we want to do? We want to impute everyone's transgression to them. We want to scapegoat people. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Each group wants to scapegoat somebody else. But Jesus didn't scapegoat those people. He didn't blame those people. In fact, he said, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. He scapegoated something else. What did he scapegoat? Death. What did he say what did he describe as the source of his injustice? Rome? No. The Jewish people? No. Death.
Yes.
So the injustice that's come to my house is death. So he accurately defines injustice first. Then he sees, well, the only answer to the death of this cross is for Abba to raise me from the dead. So now he starts looking to Abba, right? So the moment you blame someone else, the moment you scapegoat a human being for the injustice that's come upon you, is the moment you're being tempted to look to your own arm. Because I promise you, if Jesus would have scapegoated those people, do you know what would have risen up inside of him? Violence.
Yes.
Violence. The moment you scapegoat another person for your pain, violence is coming forth. And I don't just mean you beating them with your fists. We got a thing called passive aggressive, right? That's still violence.
That's right.
Violence is anything born from a heart filled with self-justification, right? Anything that comes forth from that is violence. And so we see that Jesus didn't scapegoat the people when he experienced injustice. Who did he lay at the feet of? Death, the serpent's death, and the serpent's system.
Right.
That's what he laid it at. You ain't going to cleanse this world from the serpent's wisdom. You're not. You can crucify every police officer there is. You're not going to cleanse this world from the serpent's system. Neither will you cleanse it from injustice. You're just not going to. Right? God's the only one that can do that.
That's right.
And so that's what Jesus would be busy with. And so we ought to recognize when we feel moved by injustice, the first thing we want to do is we want to think of it like God would think of it. And what would God say about it? Did Jesus say the Romans hate Jewish people, and so I'm going to have to go to the cross? Did he say that?
No.
Did he say it's because of racism that I'm going to the cross? What did he say? The world hates me. He said the world hates me. What was he? A human. The Son of Man. What was the world was founded by Adam and the prince of this world. And what does it say about Satan? Satan. He was a murderer from the beginning. A murderer of who? Human beings.
Yes.
The world and its system hates human beings. Even should we eradicate one structure that we say is not pleasant for humans, there's going to be another one right there that's going to do the same thing.
Sure. Just look through history.
Right?
Yeah.
And so what we want to see is, what is the problem? The problem is that the prince of this world hates humans. And he got it right to plant his death in the earth. And now that death is serving people with injustice. Okay? So when we encounter injustice, who are we going to scapegoat? Death and the serpent system. Right? That's who we're going to scapegoat. We're not going to scapegoat the people. Right? And then we're going to see, well, the justice that's found from death is in the resurrection. God raised the man Jesus from the dead. There's my justice. Right? The blood of Jesus cries better things than the blood of Abel. Right? What does the blood of Jesus cry? Justice has been served.
Yes.
Right? The death of death. Here I am taking your death into my flesh. Right? The death of death, like Bono said.
Yeah.
You know, I was thinking about 8, and it says that the blood of Jesus cries a better thing than the blood of Abel. And I was thinking about what the blood of Abel might have been crying. Because you know the heart of Abel, he would have been crying for his brother. And Jesus' blood forgave his brother and took the sin away and death away.
Yeah. That's exactly right. If you look at Cain, God didn't kill Cain after he murdered Abel.
That's right.
And so, man, this isn't about you should believe this or you should believe that. But, man, I hope everybody stops for a moment and recognizes that the voice of the stranger uses injustice to fill our thoughts with his thinking. right? And now that we're in the midst of all this injustice going on, we ought to stop and we ought to recognize that the stranger comes in these moments. And we ought to recognize that that's going on, so we can at least sit with God and get our thoughts about the whole thing centered with Him, right? And then let our lives be born from the Spirit, born from above, the life that comes out of us, born from above instead of born from beneath, right?
Emmanuel had his hand up. Emmanuel, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Thanks a lot. I just wanted to ask a question to Greg as far as something they touched on earlier. I forgot what it was, but my question is, do you think that there's ever coming a time, because this message of grace is just, there's so many people that need to hear it in just the church world alone. Do you think there's ever going to be a time where this becomes the popular message and that people are exposed to this truth? Because obviously we can use it in times like this, but again, like someone said, it seems like 95% of churches are bothered with the same thing. And so, I mean, it really makes me sad. I really just wonder, I don't know if the Bible says anything about it. I was just wondering, like, is this message of grace and the resurrection truth ever going to come to a place where it sees, where it's, where more light is shed on it and more people are exposed to it, particularly in these days?
Yeah, I think that it will. The way that I see it happening is that you have the Adam man in the earth, and that's the man that wants to find life by his own works, and then you have the Christ man in the earth. That's the human that is going to walk in the good work of God. And what I would say is that the church is going to come into the knowledge of the Son of God. And I would say it's underway now.
Praise God.
And so what will happen is that it'll be like a dividing
That's
line, right? There's a whole lot of people that are like, they claim God, but their heart's far from Him.
Sure.
And so that's going to be divided. But you're going to see the church growing in the revelation or the knowledge of the Son of God,
Right.
like Paul talked about, I think, in Ephesians. He called it the unity of the faith.
Mhm.
And so I do see, and that's kind of how I don't like to get into this all the time, but prophetically speaking, that's what I see going on right now. I see Christ being returned as the head of the church. And I see it going on in the worldwide right now. Now, how long that's going to take, I don't know. But what I see going on is Christ returning to being the head of the church, and we're in some process of that happening, right? And as that goes down, then people are going to be knit together in love, and they're going to come into the unity of the faith. And so it's like a cleansing of the house of God.
Yeah,
I
that's
think
good news.
Yeah.
I think when you see disparity from the truth, as we're seeing today, that it tends to bring out truth. That you have two sides of that coin, and there's like this darkness, but at the same time, in the midst of that darkness, there's a light that is arising.
Mhm.
And I think that in the end days, it's going to be just like that.
Yeah. The message of grace will never be popular to the world.
Right.
The world hates that.
Yeah.
The world is enmity against God. And listen, honestly, that's the part that breaks my heart the most. People suffering from the injustice that's in the world, and then engaging with the carnal mind about it all. That's the thing that just makes it so much worse.
Yeah, the thought I had when you said that God is the solution for injustice, my thought was that people have such poor understanding of who God is that their reaction will be then, well, why hasn't God done this?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I understood what you said exactly, and it made my heart feel really wonderful, or just gave me great peace to hear the words you've spoken. But I'm just thinking, if I sat down with the group of guys I get together with on Saturday morning and say, God is the only place that justice will be served, where injustice will be removed, I think go over their heads. I don't think they'd have a clue. as to why that's even the truth.
And that grieves my heart.
Yeah, me too.
That's what grieves my heart.
Yeah.
And it's so antithetical. Listen, if somebody does me wrong, I don't want to see them punished. And it's not because I read it on a stone.
Yeah.
It's because I've just been busy with God's way for so long now that something in my heart says that's not right.
Yeah.
That kind of a thought inside of me, it's contrary. Yeah. It's contrary to life. I'm not going to get any joy out of seeing somebody else be punished. Right. I'm not going to see any joy out of their destruction. Why would I want to see their destruction? Yeah. What can that give to me? Again, when you start really scapegoating the right thing, like Paul said, the last enemy that will be removed is death. And so death is the enemy, right? We don't war against flesh and blood. We war against principalities and powers. That's a mindset. That's the wisdom of the serpent. That's the knowledge of good and evil that is talking about there. It's not talking about individual demonic forces that we got to now wrestle with, or we got to fight with, or we got to go out into the parking lot before church and command them down, or we got to remove all the demonic forces above the city. No, it's talking about the wisdom of the serpent, right? And that's what we're at war with. Yep. The wisdom of the serpent. And the thing that breaks my heart is the people that are suffering in the world because of injustice, they're busy with the wisdom of the serpent trying to combat the injustice.
Yeah, big time. Yes.
And that wisdom is doing what it do.
Yeah.
Not only does it decide for itself that it's going to do this, but now it looks around at the other human beings and it judges them if they don't. Yeah. That's called self-righteousness. The moment you're looking at another person and judging them as good or evil based on what they do, you're busy with the devil's wisdom. Yeah. And we ought to just be honest with it. We don't have to feel ashamed, but listen, maybe I'm strange, but I feel happy when I realize that I'm busy with the devil's wisdom and it's revealed to me. Sure. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I want to know. Sure. Like, Lord, come and show me. Yeah. Right? We ought to be happy about that. We shouldn't feel ashamed about it. We should think, yeah, that thought did come from above.
That's proper chastisement.
That's when you realize, oh, the stranger, that's the voice of the stranger.
It's like I was telling you earlier. I got the answer for half of the problems that are out there. And I mean, if people just listen to me, I could fix everything. But you know what? I'll be jumping in the pot right with them.
Yeah.
And flaming, fueling the flames.
Right.
Well, like the early apostles, I mean, they didn't have an infrastructure to begin Christianity. I mean, they did it underground. They didn't have a business plan. Mm-hmm. They didn't have a government. They didn't have systematic worship that played on human emotions or whatever. Right. And so, I mean, I guess this is no different, that, whatever is born is not going to be born from an external infrastructure, but it'll be born from one person at a time inside your own temple, I guess.
That's it. Yeah. That's it. And what believers want to know is, well, just use me as an example. If I take what I know and now I want to fight against the protesters, I'm doing the same thing they're doing.
Sure.
Well, so this isn't about being for or against the protesting. This is an example we used so we could look at how we want to look at this. This is not about how we need to fight against the protesting. Right. This is not about how we need to fight against that movement. The only reason why I say what I say tonight is not to change the world. Neither is it to change the world's thinking or to get them to stop doing what they're doing. Guess what I already know? I can't. Right. And so I'm not busy with that. But you know what I am busy with? All of you guys' hearts. Yes. And all the hearts of the people out there that are walking with God and that are being tempted right now with the injustice and the self-justification that is being born from it in the earth. And I'm concerned about your hearts being lured into this fight for life, no matter what side it's on. Whether maybe you believe the police are racist and the police are brutal, and now we're going to fight against them because we're going to take our justice by force. Or whether you believe that the protesters are the ones that are brutal and the protesters are the ones that are racist, and now you're going to fight against the protesters and you're going to establish life by force. I don't care what side you're thinking with, man. That will kill both of you. And all I want for all of us, at least in the church, is to be free from all of that. Free from a life of fighting for our life. That's not the life of a son. That's not the life of a daughter of God, where you're all the time fighting for your life. And you're all the time fighting to preserve your life. And you're all the time fighting, trying to take justice by force. That's not the life of a son. The life of a son says, there's justice in my Father, and my Father will serve me with justice, and I'm walking in that, right?
Amen.
And that's the life of a son or a daughter. Now, that's antithetical to the world.
Totally.
It's the opposite of what's in the world, right?
Yep.
And so, man, I want our hearts to be protected, but I also want us to understand what we're dealing with. So that if you don't think people should be protesting, the protesters are not the devil. The protesters are not the enemy. If you think they should be protesting, the police are not the devil. The police are not the enemy.
Right.
That's not the source of injustice.
Right.
The police are not the source of injustice. Neither are the protesters the source of injustice. Death is the source of injustice.
Right.
And so if we feel angst about what the protesters are doing, or we feel angst about what the police are doing, let us scapegoat the death that entered the world. Let us not scapegoat either one of those groups of people. Let's scapegoat the death and say the death that's in the earth is really messing everything up with people, man. And then let us now start talking with God.
Yeah.
Because what will happen is we won't be lured in to the fight, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we'll be able to feel compassion for both sides, right? And I promise you, God feels compassion for both sides.
Mm-hmm.
God weeps for the police officers, and he weeps for the protesters.
Right.
Because God, the first thing he would think is it isn't right that those guys are even left in a place where they have to try to enforce law. It's not right that they have to see the things that they see. Do you think, how do you think a human being deals with that type of heinous thing that they see? You harden your heart. Your heart becomes desensitized to what you're dealing with. Do you think that works out well when you're dealing with human beings to have a desensitized heart? No. Do you think that it's a common reaction to have a desensitized heart when you're doing that kind of work? It is. How do you think soldiers cope? I mean, I spend a lot of time counseling soldiers with PTSD because they had to go to places to do what they had to do, and they're wrecked. And so, man, God weeps for the police officers because he says it's not right that they're left trying to deal with this. And he weeps for the protesters because he says it's not right that they're experiencing death in this world. And it's not right that they think they have to fight for their life. It's not right that somebody that come forth from me thinks that they got to fight for their own justice. That's not right. He sees both situations as being a cursed situation. And he sees the only answer to both sides is the resurrection, right? And so that's how we want to look at this. We want to be able to find our hearts grieving with the protesters, understanding what are they actually, if they don't understand what they're actually feeling, they don't have to. I understand what they're feeling. They're feeling death isn't right.
Yeah.
And you know what I feel? Amen. It isn't right. It isn't right that you should ever have to face anything remotely close to death. And so I can weep and hug and cry with them, and I can understand their pain, but I also understand the source of their pain is death and not these people. And so I'm not going to get caught up in their fighting of people because I'm going to see death as the real problem. Right?
Yes.
And now my words might be peppered with grace or edifying when same deal with the police officers. Right?
Yeah.
I'll feel compassion for where they're at, but I won't see the criminals as the problem. Right? I'll see death as the problem.
Right.
And I'll feel great compassion for them. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The police officers, this will mess everybody up too. If I messed up everybody on this side, I will mess it up on this side, man. The police officers' problems is not the criminals. The police officers' problems is not the criminals.
No. It's death.
It's death.
Yeah.
Right? And so when I walk with them knowing what is the real culprit and what is the real solution. right? And that doesn't mean I force it down their throat the first second. I use discernment when you walk with the person, and you pray for when's the right time and when's not the right time, right? But you might find a lot of times there's never a good time to tell the truth, right? I love what Paul said to the Galatians, am I become your enemy because I tell you the truth? Right?
Yeah.
Listen, when people are busy with self-justification, it doesn't matter which side they're busy with it on. When they hear the truth, a lot of times they don't like it. And they become angry, right? Because they don't want to hear that. Because they're busy wanting to fight for their life.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Shelley wanted to say something. Shelley, go ahead.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Now we can see you.
Hi. Jay, I know you know, but I don't know if anybody else knows. Aaron's deep into this protest thing.
Yeah.
And him and I had a conversation tonight. A lot of what you're saying, Greg, he doesn't see it that way. In fact, he said to me when I told him that God is crying over what's going on, and he said, God crying? I can't imagine if God's crying, why isn't he done something? It's been 400 years. And I'm like, son, you know, there's not a thing you can do about it. You're fighting against something that's bigger than you could even think. And the only thing that can fix this is God. Well, how is God going to do that? And I said, the way you fix it is by going to God and saying, what the hell? This is hurting. This is not right. You've got to take control of this situation. And I thank you for it. Just, you know, thank you, Lord, for what you're doing in the earth, even if we don't see it. And he's even said that, like my one son, he believes the lies. He's believing the lie of racism. He plays that card. And my daughter's getting married this weekend. And I'm concerned that there's going to be a problem because my youngest son, Aaron, of course, said that if Sam says any racist remark, he's going to basically disown him. And I'm like, this is exactly what the enemy wants, is for the separation of people, of God's people. And we all grieve. And Aaron's doing it. I believe Aaron's doing it in the right heart. He's just believing a lie. That what he has to do is step up for the injustice of the Black people being mistreated by police officers. But on the opposite coin, he doesn't believe that if a police officer is killed in the middle of whatever, that it's injustice because he took on the uniform. And so there's a lot of.
Try telling his wife and his kids that.
Yeah.
And that's And that's my whole point. And Aaron's been probably filled with the wisdom of the world. See, if you only identify with the injustice of one group, then that's called self-righteousness. And I don't mean that in the sense we think of arrogance, right? What it means is you're living by the knowledge of good and evil. And you've decided what's good and you've decided what's evil. And then you judge everything that way. So it's evil it's only evil also for a Black person to be killed by a police officer. It's not evil for a white person to be killed by a police officer.
Exactly.
Because you don't see any protesting of that, right? It's only one group of people that's killed by a police officer. And there's never any, well, it's unjust for a police officer to be killed. No, it's not. Because my knowledge of good and evil says that, well, because that's the job they took on, that it's okay for them to die. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter for their wife or their kids or their husband. It doesn't matter about any of that. And that's a symptom of what we're talking about, right? Where you can't see the injustice. If you can't see that everybody has suffered injustice, you're not busy with the sight of God. You're busy with the sight of the carnal mind, right? And you're right, Shelley. I mean, Aaron's a sweet kid. And it's like, it's information that we're fed. And I think it's interesting what you said. When's God's going to do something? It's been 400 years. 400 years. It's been 6,000 years. That's right. What do you mean 400 years? I mean, Cain murdered Abel how long ago? How long ago? I mean, and so it's been 6,000 years, and God has done something, but we don't want what God did. We want to establish this world, right? Because we want a world we can build with our own hands.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We don't want to walk in the world that God built.
Right.
Right?
Right.
But again, if you're busy with the mind of Christ, you'll feel compassion on both sides. You'll discern why everyone's so moved. Everyone's so moved because death is contrary to human.
Yes.
And it's nearly impossible for us not to feel it. Right? But how are we going to view it when we feel it? Who are we going to process it with? Are we going to deal with it through the knowledge of good and evil? Or are we going to deal with it through the knowledge of the Son of God? Right? And that's what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
That's what we want to see. We want everybody in the picture to become humanized.
I know, because, this is probably, I would never say this to anybody outside of this group, but that police officer didn't want to bring death. Nobody wants to bring death. And so,
Right.
A part of me thinks for him, what had overcome him to do that? That's just as sad for
Fear of
that
death.
family. Yeah, for his
His fear of death caused the
That-
death of the other guy.
No, absolutely. Yeah. His heart's hardened
Yeah.
because of dealing with death all the time,
Yeah,
which is what humans do when they encounter death.
Sure.
We have to harden our hearts.
Right.
Otherwise, we can't deal with it. Even if we encounter like pain in a relationship, we harden our hearts because we don't want to deal with that pain again. But you're absolutely right. God weeps for the police officers that had the knee in the back. And this is what's inconvenient for all of us, is that Jesus was busy preferring the life of the oppressors over his own.
Yeah.
He wasn't, look what's happening to my life.
No.
He felt compassion for the oppressors.
That's
Now
right.
listen, Jesus is a word made flesh about everything. That's a real protest. Do you know what he protested in that situation? He protested death. And do you know how he protested death? I will not be moved by the death that's in this world. That's how he protested death. He rejected the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's the only kind of a real protest there is. And do you see how that ended the violence? See how he didn't return violence with violence?
Right.
He overcome evil with good. Love covers a multitude of sins. Right?
Yes.
That's a real protest. We don't want to hear that. No, that doesn't fit with our idea of a protest. Neither can it help us burn off the steam we feel.
No.
Right?
Exactly.
I mean, we go on our protest, and then listen, we feel more righteous, right? Like, look at the good we've done. And on the other side, if you're against the protesters, you gather together with your friends and you speak about those evil protesters, and then you feel more righteous, right? Yes, look at us, we're the righteous ones. They're the unrighteous ones. Listen, anytime you're looking at situations like that, you're walking with the serpent. And what I mean by that is you're thinking with his wisdom, right? And that's how you know.
What if you're just so confused as to why people think that hurting somebody else's property or killing somebody else is gonna bring about justice? Because I'm not angry about it. I'm just so confused. Like, what? I'm trying to make sense out of it, and I guess you can't make sense out of stupid.
No, you can. But what I think where you're jumping to is you're jumping to the fruit. The fruit isn't a well thought out.
Yeah, fertilizer.
It's not like they went off and thought about this in a calculated way with nothing there, right? They didn't just out of the blue decide this. It's the result of a wisdom dwelling in you. And then that wisdom processes what you see, and it brings forth certain activity, right, out of your hand, right? So it's not that they're stupid or anything like that. It's that if you are looking to your own strength for justice, those are the things that are going to come forth, right? Those are the only things that are going to come forth. So it's not like a surprise that that's what's coming forth. Should a person try to fight to establish their own justice, what's coming forth is destruction. Right? And it's going to look like destruction in a number of different ways. That's what's coming forth. Now, if a person is busy with the strength of God and what God does to serve justice, then what's going to come out of them in the face of injustice is love and peace and joy and patience and long suffering and meekness. But if a person's busy with the arm of the flesh, when they face injustice, do you know what's coming out of them? Envy, gossiping, backbiting, hatred, murder, all of that. And so that's what's coming. If you're walking after the flesh, that's what's coming when you encounter injustice, right?
Michelle, one of the key building blocks that we laid early on in this walk that most of us are on now was the fact that belief precedes action in every way. So when we see the fruit or precedes the fruit of a person's life, whether it's of the flesh or of God, that's the fruit of the belief system that's in their heart. And so once you come to grips with that, then it becomes like, well, now I know why this person is responding this way, because they believe this lie.
Right.
They have this belief about something, whether, and it bears fruit either of the flesh or it bears the fruit of the spirit one way or another. Man, once that foundation block is in there, it helped me tremendously to start to put the pieces together.
Yeah, I can see that with respect to the protesting and the people taking one side or the other. But as far as the murdering and the rioting and all that, my brain, I have a hard time seeing how that's going to bring about any justice.
No, it's not. But that's the fruit that comes from a person thinking they're going to bring about justice. Because that's the only thing. It's like a person taken captive, coming under the power of the beast.
That's why Paul would say there's nothing good that dwells in the flesh. Yeah. In that arm of like action to establish justice.
It's like my dog. When my dog wants to smell the other dog's butt, right? It don't make no sense to me because I'm not busy trying to smell people's butts. Yeah. But then all of a sudden I realize, it's a dog.
Yeah,
it's come under the power of dog. Right? It can't help itself.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But listen, this is upsetting to the world. And listen, this isn't political. It's become political.
Yeah.
But it's not. And the moment you see people making it political, that gives another big, gigantic red flag that this is not born from above. But the thing that I want to say, and this is, I want to say it this way, and I probably already did, just so we could see the carnal mind from the mind of God. It's not right what happened to George Floyd. It's also not right what happened to the Chauvin police officers. That's what Jesus would think.
It's not either or.
No, Jesus would think it's not right what happened to both of them.
Death is the root cause.
Right. Now, if we're not busy with that, then we're not busy with the Spirit, and we don't know what spirit we're of. And I'm not surprised that the world doesn't know what spirit it's of. But the church, man, is what really surprises me. That we don't know what's, not us individually here, but I mean worldwide, that we don't know what spirit we're of. Right? I mean, listen.
Well, two things. You saw that movie Moonstruck? It was with Nicolas Cage and Cher.
Yeah.
And Cher's mother, a father was fooling around on her mother, and she asked a profound question: why do men fool around on their wives? And she thought about it, rubbed her chin. She goes, "They fear death." And it was sort of a profound response, but that's like real prophetic.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But I see also the church, and that's why people are so worn out. It's sort of a different thing, but the church is worn out because they're trying to be Jesus rather than letting Jesus be Jesus.
Yep.
Yeah,
and so they get worn out. Right. So they're all like running around like crazy people, serving this, serving that. We got to do this. We got to do that. We got to do this. We got to do this to fix it. We got to be politically correct with this issue. We got to kowtow to this person with this issue, and we don't want to offend this person with this issue. And they end up making everybody mad out, rather than just saying, hey, just step back and you sort of just point to Jesus and say he gives life, and step back and let Jesus do his thing. But I think the church tries to usurp the power of Jesus and do it themselves.
Right.
And
We're
that's
still
why
trying
they
to take
all-
the kingdom by
That's
force.
why they all get burned out, and the people who go to church get burned out, and then they feel responsible for it. They feel like, I have to do something tangibly, or there's something defective with me. Rather than sitting back and resting and saying, okay, if God wants me to, help out in the situation, he'll put me there. And he'll let his compassion just flow out of me, but I don't really need to do anything except just go with Jesus' flow.
That's right. That's right.
But and also too, it's when people try to imitate Jesus, non-Christians know that's disingenuous. And it ultimately hurts the cause, because they say, I don't want to be this, I don't want to be, because you're a hypocrite when you try to imitate Jesus.
Right. Yeah, John 10:10 is a really good descriptor of exactly what's going on right now, right? The thief comes to kill, to steal, and destroy. But Jesus comes to bring us life, and to bring us life more abundantly.
But the church didn't come to bring in life and life
No,
more abundantly. Or
Christ came.
Yeah.
Right. Hey, listen, if you're judging people as righteous or unrighteous by what side they line up on the protest, you're thinking like the devil thinks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because a person isn't righteous based on what they think or don't think about the protest. That's not what makes a person righteous or unrighteous.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, man, I just hope we could we'll navigate this a lot better in our own hearts, and then we actually might be of some effect, right? Around the people that we interact with, right? And listen, you guys already are of great effect. Linda and I were talking about it today. The way that Linda is with people, right, is healing. Every time someone meets Linda, they've seen God.
Amen.
Right? And it's like that with all of us. I just bring up Linda because her and I were specifically talking about it, right? That's more healing than a million signs Linda could make that have a fancy slogan on them. Just the way she lives and moves and has her being within the Spirit. And we're all that way. We live and move and have our being in the Spirit of God. And just walking with God in the earth has a sweet air fragrance. It's a sweet smelling savor, right? And it can affect things like that. And it's much more genuine, right? Like Doug's saying, it's much more genuine when it happens that way. And then people can know, right?
Right. I think this is a good place to wrap it up.
Yep. Thank you.
Does everybody understand what we're saying there?
Yes.
Right?
It's very clear.
We're all against injustice. And we all want healing from injustice. But if we don't know the source of injustice, then we won't know what heals injustice. And then we're going to spend all our time fighting injustice and never being comforted from injustice. Right? So rejecting the world's idea of how to find justice is not rejecting justice. It's actually rejecting injustice, because the world's idea of how to find justice is actually what brings injustice. Right?
Yes.
And so let's not, we don't want to be, as the body of Christ, we don't want to be conformed to the world's way of thinking right now. Because I promise you, the world is not satisfied with having its way of thinking. It wants everyone to adopt its way of thinking, and it wants to kill the people that won't.
Yes.
Why do you think it nailed Jesus to a tree?
That's not tolerant.
Right? Anybody who protests trying to take life by force, by in their heart saying, I will not lift one finger to establish my own life, that's a real protest. Anyone who takes that protest, the world hates them. Right? And you can tell.
Right. Amen. Amen. All right, gang.
Okay.
Thank you much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Glory to God.
I'll post the video on YouTube tonight.
Yeah,
We can go back, and this is one of those you're going to want to listen to over and over and over again.
I think 2 years ago we did a lot about injustice too. We covered it a lot.
It didn't stick.
It was gone.
Just a lot of political correctness, and a lot of similar things, just in different ways.
When was that?
It was a couple years ago. We had a lot of Bible studies about it.
Yeah.
I think we were talking about just a lot of PC stuff, political correctness.
Yeah, we were.
We might have been talking about white privilege, right?
Yep.
And so we spent a lot of time talking about how that alienates people. And I think I brought up my friend, and I don't bring this up to disparage any group of people. I bring this up because it's just a fact. In my life, I've had many of my close friends murdered by people of a different race than my race, right? I don't feel negative about that race of people, right? I just don't. But the example I brought up is you try telling my friend's mom, who was murdered out on a pier and his girlfriend raped when he was 16 years old, that she's got some type of white privilege. You look her in the face and tell her about her privilege, and she'll spit on you, right? Because she has not lived a privileged life. Her son was murdered when he was 16 years old. And if you want to come and try and tell her about how she should sympathize with your injustice by telling her about her privileged life, you have lost the battle already. And so when we deal with people as if they have some privilege that we don't have, without recognizing that all of us have some privilege in some area that somebody else don't have. Listen, LeBron James has got a whole lot of privileges that I don't have and that I will never have. Right? But I'm not walking around talking about his privilege. Neither am I walking around complaining about his privilege. Now, could he make an argument that I have some privilege in some area he doesn't have? Maybe so. But that's not the point. And the more we try to make that the point, the more we end up divided, fighting with each other. But the more we can look at each other's faces, no matter what race we are, and we can look in their face and we can know they've suffered like us, then we can come together. And then we can talk to each other about what we've suffered. And then we can actually minister to one another, right? But the moment we come and tell somebody they should care about our suffering by telling them about their privilege, where we know nothing about their life, try telling my mom she lived a privileged life. She was put in a cage when she was 2 years old and repeatedly sexually abused and raped and tormented by the priest, her grandfather, and the town doctor. You gonna try and tell her about her privileged life? Her parents gave her up to the grandparents because they wanted to buy a car and they didn't want to have to be boggled down with taking care of a child. And so the moment we come, now my mom has been delivered, so she wouldn't become offended if someone told her she was privileged. But I'm just using that as an example. We don't know what people have been through, and a person's skin color doesn't describe their plight, right? And we ought to understand that everyone has suffered great injustice. And now let us see that about one another, because we might actually start trying to uphold each other.
Amen.
Right?
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
All right.
All right, now I'm going to say good night.
That needs to be recorded.
Good night.
Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night, everybody.
Good night.
We love you
Good
all.
night. Thanks, guys.
Good night.
Night, Billy.